Welcome back to our channel, where we bring you the most disturbing and chilling stories that will make your skin crawl. Today, we dive into a story that blends mystery, fear, and the unexplained. What happens when your peaceful new home turns into a house of horrors? Join us as we tell the story of the Phantom of Willow Creek. Buckle up, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for a terrifying ride. And don't forget, if you enjoy stories like these, be sure to subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon for more creepy tales. Now, let's begin. Story number 1. When John and Emily moved into their new home on Willow Creek Road, it seemed like the perfect fresh start. They had found the house at Estelle, a picturesque cottage with a sprawling yard. Nestled in the serene countryside, the couple couldn't have been happier. Life had been busy and chaotic for both of them, and this quiet, rural setting was exactly what they needed to unwind and reconnect. The first few days were blissful. Emily spent her time gardening and fixing up the house, while John worked remotely from his new office overlooking the creek. They loved the peacefulness of the area. No traffic, no noise, just the sound of birds and the gentle breeze through the trees. But that peace was shattered one cold autumn evening. John was working late in his office when he heard a faint knocking sound. He paused, straining to hear where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere inside the house, but Emily was already in bed, fast asleep. He stood up and checked the front door. Nothing. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just the house settling, and returned to his desk. The next morning, Emily mentioned hearing strange sounds during the night, a soft tapping, almost like someone knocking on the windows. John hadn't mentioned his experience the previous night, but now he was concerned. He told her about the knocking, and they agreed it was probably just the wind. After all, the house was old, and old houses made strange noises. A few more days passed without incident, and John and Emily soon forgot about the strange sounds. But one night, things took a darker turn. It was late, and John had just finished working for the day. Emily was already in bed, and he decided to join her. As he climbed into bed, he noticed that the room felt unusually cold. He pulled the blankets up around him, but the chill seemed to seep through the covers. He glanced over at Emily, who was sound asleep. Suddenly, he heard the knocking again, but this time, it was louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. His heart raced as he listened, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But then the knocking changed. It became a slow, deliberate tap, 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 as if someone was knocking on the bedroom door itself. John sat up, his pulse quickening. He carefully slipped out of bed and crept to the door, opening it just a crack. The hallway was empty, but the tapping continued, echoing down the stairs. He could hear it now, coming from somewhere downstairs. The kitchen, maybe. He grabbed his phone and quietly descended the stairs, following the sound. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint light of the moon shining through the windows. The knocking had stopped. John stood in the doorway, staring at the windows. For a moment, everything was still. Then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw movement, a shadow darting past behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty. It took him hours to fall asleep. The next morning, John told Emily what had happened. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. She hadn't experienced anything quite so vivid, but she admitted that the house had begun to feel off to her as well. They both agreed that it was probably just their imaginations running wild, fueled by the isolation and quiet of the countryside. But neither of them truly believed that. The next few nights were quiet, but the uneasy feeling in the house only grew stronger. John and Emily started feeling as if they were being watched. The air in the house seemed heavier, more oppressive. They both began to dread the nights, when the house seemed to come alive with unsettling sounds. One evening, as they were sitting together in the living room, the knocking started again. This time, it was loud, almost deafening. It echoed through the house, filling every room. John jumped to his feet, determined to find the source. He grabbed a flashlight and stormed through the house, checking every window, every door, every corner, but there was nothing. No one. When he returned to the living room, Emily was standing in front of the large mirror that hung over the fireplace, her face pale. She pointed to the glass, her hand shaking. There, in the fogged-up surface of the mirror, were 3 long, dark handprints, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass from the inside. John's stomach turned. They hadn't touched the mirror. In fact, they hadn't even cleaned it since moving in. The handprints were impossibly large, with long, slender fingers, and they seemed to almost shimmer in the dim light. Without a word, John grabbed his phone and called a friend who worked as a local historian. His friend told him that the house had once belonged to a reclusive man named William, who lived alone after the tragic death of his wife and child. William was said to have become obsessed with communicating with their spirits, conducting strange rituals in the house. Eventually, he vanished without a trace, and the house sat empty for years. That night, John and Emily packed a few bags and left the house, staying with friends in town. They couldn't bear to stay another night in the place that had once felt like their dream home, but now felt more like a nightmare. A few days later, they returned to the house with a paranormal investigator, hoping for some answers. The investigator spent hours inside the house, using all kinds of equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuation, and sound recordings. At one point, he set up a camera in front of the mirror in the living room. When they reviewed the footage later that evening, they were horrified by what they saw. The camera had captured something, a dark, shadowy figure standing in front of the mirror, its hand pressed against the glass, leaving the same long, dark handprints they had seen earlier. The figure slowly turned, revealing a distorted, gaunt face before vanishing into thin air. The investigator confirmed what John and Emily had feared all along. The house was haunted, and the spirit was not a benevolent one. It was attached to the mirror, likely drawn there by William's rituals, and it wasn't going to leave easily. John and Emily made the difficult decision to sell the house and move away, leaving Willow Creek and its haunting past behind them. They never spoke of what they had seen to anyone outside of their closest friends, and they never returned to the house again. As for the house on Willow Creek Road, it sits empty once more, its windows dark and lifeless, waiting for its next unsuspecting occupants. Story number 2. Grace had never believed in ghosts. To her, the idea of spirits lingering in the mortal world was nothing more than an invention for campfire stories and late-night horror movies. So, when she and her husband, Eric, moved into their new Victorian-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she brushed off the house's reputation as just a bunch of silly rumors. The house had stood vacant for years, and the previous owners had been quick to sell it at a bargain price. It was the perfect size for Grace, Eric, and their 2 young children, Lily and Ben. Sure, the house was old, but it had character. Grace loved the high ceilings, the wide windows, and the spacious attic that ran the length of the house. She imagined turning the attic into a playroom or a quiet retreat for reading. But the moment they moved in, something felt off. It started on the first night. Grace was unpacking boxes in the living room when she heard a faint, distant whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. She paused, listening, but it was gone. Figuring it was just the wind moving through the old house, she shrugged and went back to work. Every night, after the kids were tucked in and the house had settled into silence, Grace would hear it again. A soft, barely audible voice drifting through the walls. At first, she thought it might be Lily or Ben talking in their sleep. But when she checked on them, they were always sound asleep, undisturbed by the strange noises. Eric, who worked late shifts and wasn't home at night, dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to the house's age. One night, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. Grace was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard it again, only this time, It sounded like it was coming from directly above her. From the attic, chills ran down her spine. Could there be animals up there? Mice or squirrels? Maybe. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Grace grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the attic door. The attic was accessed by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. Grace had only been up there once during the house inspection, and she remembered it being dusty and full of cobwebs, but otherwise empty. As she pulled the ladder down, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. Grace hesitated at the foot of the ladder, the beam of her flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. She took a deep breath and began to climb. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old trunks and forgotten furniture. The flashlight's beam flickered as she swept it across the room. Nothing. The space was exactly as she remembered it, silent, still, and seemingly untouched. But then, as she turned to leave, she heard it again. A voice, soft and indistinct, seemed to come from one of the corners of the attic. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned the flashlight toward the sound. There, in the farthest corner, stood an old, antique rocking chair. It hadn't been there before, or had it? Grace couldn't remember seeing it during the house inspection. The chair creaked softly, as if it had just been rocking back and forth. The whispering seemed to grow louder around it, though she still couldn't make out what the voice was saying. Grace felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the rocking chair, and hurried back down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut behind her. The whispering stopped once again, leaving the house in a heavy, oppressive silence. Grace tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Over the next few days, she avoided the attic, but the whispering continued, growing louder each night. She tried to explain it to Eric, but he remained skeptical. It's just the house settling, he'd say. Old houses make weird noises, but Grace knew it was more than that. Then, one night, something happened that she couldn't ignore. It was around 2 a.m. when Grace was jolted awake by the sound of Lily screaming. She rushed into her daughter's room and found Lily sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Grace asked, trying to calm her down. Lily pointed toward the ceiling, her little voice trembling. "The lady. She was whispering to me." Grace's blood ran cold. "What lady?" "The lady in the attic," Lily whispered, her wide eyes full of fear. "She said she's lonely." Grace felt her heart drop into her stomach. Lily had never mentioned the attic before. How could she have known? Grace hadn't told her about the strange noises, hadn't said anything that could have put the idea in her head. Terrified, Grace brought Lily into her bedroom and let her sleep with her for the rest of the night. The whispering didn't come back that night, but the next day, Grace knew she had to find out what was going on. She did some research at the local library, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening in her house. After hours of digging through old records, she stumbled across an article from nearly a century ago. The house had once belonged to a widow named Margaret Sloane. Margaret had lost her husband in a tragic accident and had become a recluse, rarely leaving the house. Rumor had it that she had gone mad with grief and spent her last years locked away in the attic, whispering to herself, rocking in her chair. She had died alone in that very attic, and her body wasn't discovered until weeks later. Grace felt a chill crawl up her spine. Margaret Sloane had never left the attic. Her spirit had stayed, whispering in the darkness, waiting for someone to hear her. That night, as Grace lay in bed, the whispering returned. It was louder now, clearer, as if the voice was right beside her. She could make out the words this time, "I'm so lonely. Please, help me." Terrified, Grace knew she had to act. The next morning, she called a local priest to bless the house. He agreed to come, performing a cleansing ritual and blessing every room, including the attic. For the first time in weeks, the house felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The whispering stopped. In the weeks that followed, the house returned to normal. Grace, Eric, Lily, and Ben were able to settle in without any further disturbances. The attic door remained closed, and Grace never went up there again. But every now and then, in the dead of night, Grace would lie awake, straining to hear, and sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she could still hear a faint whispering coming from the attic, as if Margaret Sloane was still there, waiting for someone to listen. Story number 3. The first time Claire noticed something strange about the basement, she was unpacking boxes. She and her boyfriend, Daniel, had just moved into their first house together, a charming old place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was everything they'd wanted, affordable, spacious, and with enough quirks to make it interesting. The basement was a bit of an afterthought, dark, musty, and unfinished, with a single, weak light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But for storage, it was perfect. As Claire unpacked boxes of winter clothes and old holiday decorations, she had that feeling, an itch between her shoulder blades, like someone was watching her. She paused, looking around the dimly lit space. Nothing, just the rows of shelves Daniel had installed, the old washing machine, and the boxes. Still, the feeling didn't go away, lingering as she hurried to finish and get back upstairs. When she mentioned it to Daniel that night, he laughed it off. Basements are always creepy. It's probably just your imagination. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. He was right. The basement was old and shadowy, and of course, it would feel eerie. But even as she agreed, she couldn't shake the sense that something down there was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Claire avoided going into the basement as much as possible, but sometimes it was necessary, especially when Daniel was at work and she needed something. Every time she went down, the same feeling of being watched would return. The air seemed heavier in the basement, thicker, and the single light bulb didn't seem to penetrate the darkness fully, leaving deep shadows in the corners. One evening, Daniel came home late from work. Claire had already eaten dinner and was curled up on the couch, reading a book. Daniel kissed her on the forehead and mentioned that he needed to go down to the basement to check the fuse box. Apparently, the lights in the kitchen had flickered earlier that day. As Daniel headed down, Claire heard a loud bang from the basement. She jumped up, rushing to the door. "Daniel, are you okay?" she called down. There was no response for a moment. Then she heard Daniel's voice, sounding distant and a little off. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just dropped something." Claire felt a wave of relief but couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. When Daniel finally came back up, he looked pale. "What happened down there?" she asked, noticing his shaken expression. Daniel hesitated. I don't know. It was weird. I thought I saw something in the corner, like a shadow. But when I looked again, it was gone. Probably just the lighting." Claire felt her stomach twist. She had never mentioned her own feelings about the basement to Daniel. For the first time, she told him about the sense of being watched, the heavy air, and the way the shadows seemed to shift. Daniel brushed it off, but Claire could tell he was unsettled. He was the logical one, the skeptic. For him to be spooked meant something. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Claire started noticing small things that unnerved her. The basement door, which they always kept closed, would sometimes be open when she walked past it, even though she knew she hadn't touched it. The light in the basement would occasionally flicker, even though Daniel had replaced the bulb. And the shadows, they seemed to move, just at the edge of her vision, only to be gone when she looked directly at them. One night, Claire woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was Daniel getting up for a glass of water. But when she rolled over, she saw that Daniel was still asleep beside her. The footsteps continued, soft but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The footsteps seemed to stop just outside their bedroom door. She held her breath, staring at the sliver of light coming from the hallway. And then, slowly, she saw a shadow, darker than the rest of the hallway, standing just beyond the door frame. Her pulse quickened. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as if watching. She squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself it was just her imagination, but when she opened them again, the shadow was still there. Claire nudged Daniel awake. Whispering his name urgently, he stirred, groggy and confused. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Look," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel blinked in the darkness, looking toward the hallway. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. "You were dreaming," Daniel said, pulling her close. "There's nothing there," but Claire knew she hadn't imagined it. The next morning, she insisted that they call someone to check the house for any problems. Maybe it was a draft or electrical issue causing the strange occurrences, Daniel agreed. Though he still seemed skeptical, the electrician came the following day and found nothing wrong with the wiring or the light fixtures. But as he was leaving, he glanced toward the basement door, his expression darkening. "Old houses like this, they have a history," he said, almost as an afterthought. "You ever notice anything strange down in the basement?" Claire froze. "Why do you ask?" The man shrugged. "Just a feeling. You know, basements are funny like that. Sometimes things get left behind." After he left, Claire felt more uneasy than ever. What had he meant by things get left behind? That night, Daniel was called into work unexpectedly, leaving Claire alone in the house. She tried to distract herself with TV, but every sound made her jump. Finally, she decided to go to bed early. Around midnight, she heard the basement door creak open. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The door was open, she was sure of it. Then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps reached her ears, coming up from the basement. She grabbed her phone, her hand shaking as she dialed Daniel's number. But before it could ring, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a whisper, a low, hoarse voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a jolt of terror through Claire. She bolted out of bed, running to the basement door. It was wide open, but there was no one there. Her pulse raced as she slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away with trembling hands. That night, Claire stayed awake, too scared to sleep, watching the basement door from the couch. The whispering continued, faint and distant, coming from beneath the floor. When Daniel returned the next morning, Claire told him everything. He was alarmed, finally believing her after seeing how terrified she was. They decided to leave the house that day, staying with friends while they tried to figure out what to do next. A week later, they called in a paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. After spending hours in the house, the investigator sat them down and delivered the news they feared the most. The house was haunted by a malevolent spirit, something tied to the basement. The shadow they had seen was no trick of the light, it was real, and it wasn't going to leave easily. Claire and Daniel moved out of the house shortly after. Unwilling to stay another night, they sold it to another family. But to this day, they wonder if the shadow in the basement is still there, watching, waiting. That concludes the story of the shadow in the basement. Sometimes, the darkest parts of our homes hide the most terrifying secrets. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Have your own scary experiences. Share them in the comments, and maybe we'll feature them in a future video. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you ever feel like something is watching you from the shadows, you might not be alone. Sleep tight.